Today for Marvel Mondays, I'm going to be taking a look at the Marvel Legends Spider-Man animated series, Smythe vs Peter Parker 2-pack. This has quickly become one of the most anticipated releases of the year, judging by some of the comments on my previous videos. And it's hard to believe that this set was only announced just a few weeks ago at San Diego Comic-Con, but here it is in my hands. Now I think one of the reasons for the popularity of this set and the anticipation around it is because this is very much distinctly from the animated series. Both this version of Peter Parker and this version of Smythe are unique to that animated series, and it definitely has that nostalgic draw for anyone who grew up in the 90s watching this animated series. So without further ado, let's take a look at the packaging. Now if you've been collecting any of the other 2-pack figures in this line in recent months, you'll know what to expect here. Essentially a very small cardboard box in which the figures are sort of crammed inside, but we have this really nice image on the front of the packaging. This is largely text free. We have the fantastic animated series Spider-Man logo. We have these two great images of Smythe and Peter Parker sort of wrestling with each other, which looks really vibrant and colourful and fun and just action packed, and definitely evokes the spirit of the animated series, which is really nice to see. And if you grew up playing with the Spider-Man animated series figures from Toy Biz in the 90s, you'll definitely appreciate the layout and the design. And I for one have always loved the colours and the cityscape in the background. If we look at the side panel, we can see that this branding extends all the way around the packaging, and we have those famous billboard images there of the two characters fighting each other against the Spider-Man logo, which is pretty cool. But if you want a change, you can actually flip this around and display the other side panel on your shelf if you want, and this replicates the old VHS style for those who grew up in the 90s watching VHS cassettes. And then finally on the reverse, again we have the consistent style and approach that Toy Biz adopted in the 90s for their action figures. I really like this background that we see against these characters. But a lot of this packaging, in fact half of the packaging on the back, is dedicated to this very, very small print, which is a bit distracting and it's not the most presentable. But the top of the packaging is actually pretty nice. But all things considered, you're probably going to want to display this with the front of the packaging on display, or perhaps you might want to stack this up on your shelf on its side profile. The packaging is top loaded, so of course you can lift that lid up, fold open the flaps, and then pull out the two interior card inserts. Now this holds the two figures in place. Now unfortunately their bits and pieces tend to flop out and fall out because they're just contained loosely in rice paper, which isn't great. And the figures themselves are nicely secured in this cardboard packaging, but they're quite tricky to get back into the packaging once you've had them out on display. So let's start off by taking a look at the Peter Parker figure. Now I think a great many of us were quite excited to actually have a Peter Parker from the animated series. I actually don't own a single Peter Parker in my collection, so this is something of a novelty, but a very welcome one because I'm such a fan of the animated series. And I have to say, I think Hasbro have done an excellent job of capturing the likeness of Peter Parker as he appears in the animated series. This is pretty good. Now, it's not pitch perfect, but it's pretty darn close, and I think they've done a really excellent job here. Right down to the little quiff and the single strand of hair across the forehead there. But with a critical eye, I definitely have to point out that there's a real lack of paint wash on this figure as a whole, and it's most noticeable, I think, in the hair. Now the hair's nicely moulded, but there's no wash running through this, there's no shading or shadowing anywhere, so it does look and feel quite plasticky, and it's such a shame because I think if it just had a little bit of a wash in there, it would definitely give it a lot more depth and texture and make it feel more authentic. And the sad news, for me at least, is that they do seem to have completely abandoned the idea of doing any more cell shading on these figures. Now, that might please a lot of people, but for me I actually quite like that approach, so I'm disappointed that we don't see it anymore. When we look at the overall body sculpt, I think we've seen a lot of these pieces used before on other figures. I don't think there's anything particularly new here, but it all looks pretty good. Again, my only criticism is that there's sadly no paint washes, no shading anywhere on this figure to really draw out the fantastic detail in the sculpt and just add a little bit more depth to it. And to be fair, you could argue that this is based on the animated series, so it doesn't really need a lot of over-complex colours and shading and paint washes, and I take that point, but just a little something here and there would definitely make all the difference, I feel. If we take a quick look at the articulation, there is a ball joint at the top of the neck, allowing the head to spin all the way around, lean left and right, and of course nod up and down a pretty healthy distance too. There's ball joints in the shoulders, so the arms will lift up and out. There is a complementary bicep swivel there as well. Then sadly at the elbow they have just opted for a single pin swivel, which is a little bit disappointing rather than having a double joint at the elbow there. But that lower forearm will rotate all the way around, it will hinge to 90 degrees. And of course we have another pin swivel at the wrist, allowing that hand to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. And thankfully that watch is a separate piece, so it will move with the articulation. Now his jacket is a hard plastic, but it is flexible enough to allow the figure to move from side to side through a single swivel at the waist and the ab crunch at the top of the chest there, allowing the figure to bend forwards and backwards. Now it's a little bit unseemly in the way it looks with that big line, but it's serviceable and I suppose it does the job. Now there's ball joints in the hips, so the legs will kick out to the side. There's a complementary thigh swivel at the top there. The legs will kick forwards, they'll go back, and then there's a double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way backwards. Finally, there is a ball joint at the ankle, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also pivot from side to side. In terms of accessories, he's pretty light, but he does come with some fun ones, including 2 thwipping hands and his camera. Now I really like the camera accessory, it's nice and bulky, it's very much representative of what we see on screen, and I think they've done a really nice job of bringing this to life, and he has no problems holding it in either of his hands, and it looks really solid actually. This is a really nice prop and quite colourful as well. If we look at his 2 thwipping hands, obviously there's nothing really fresh or original here except that they are bare hands, they're not gloved hands, but I think this looks really good. My only criticism is I really wish they'd actually given him his web shooters that they could actually slide onto his arms to just make this look a little bit more authentic. But other than that, this looks pretty cool. And as a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to Mary Jane. I really like that we have both of these figures in their civilian outfits. I think this is really cool. They look great together, they scale very nicely, and this is definitely representative of what we see on screen. So I think they've done a really nice job with this, and this is really very fun to see. Okay then, so for me, this is a 3-star figure. Now, there's nothing bad about this figure. In fact, I'm very pleased with a lot of elements of it. I really like having this great sculpt. I really like having this fantastic version of this character that's pretty much screen accurate, which is fantastic. I like his accessories, even though I feel like they could have expanded a little bit more. Maybe some webs, some of those web shooters, or something else just to really bulk out the character. But this is still fine. This is very serviceable, and I haven't really got any criticisms around that. Where my criticisms do come in, it's around the articulation and around the shading. So I mentioned already that it's a shame that we have that big wedge, that big gap with the ab crunch at the top of the chest there. It's very distracting and it just doesn't seem necessary when we could have just had a nice ball joint in here, or maybe not even had an ab crunch. I'm not sure if it's strictly necessary. So that is very distracting to me, and it just feels a little bit off whenever I look at it. The other major issue, as I touched on there, is around the paint apps, and it's really about the shading, particularly when it comes to the hair and other parts of the body, where I just feel like a little bit of shading here and there. It doesn't have to be full-on cell shading, as I know a lot of people aren't happy with that, although I think that probably would be the best compromise for this kind of figure. But you know, just some washes here and there just to add a little bit of depth and texture to it, because without it, although it is obviously based on the animated series, it still feels a little bit stark and a bit plastic-like, and I think, you know, you want to feel like there's a bit more depth and texture to your figures. Okay, so next up we have Smythe, and this is definitely going to be one of the more anticipated figures in this animated series collection, because he's one of the more reoccurring villains in the series. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular look for this character is definitely distinctively from the animated series. Now, he did have this look in the comic books as well, but he's a bit more spindly, a little bit more lean than he appears in the animated series. In the animated series, he's a lot bulkier, he's a lot more muscular. And I have to say, once again, Hasbro have knocked it out of the park when it comes to the sculpting. This is pretty much pitch perfect. I think they've done an excellent job, particularly with this head sculpt, the hairstyle, the mullet that he's got there. But also, if we look at the paint apps around the eyes, and the eyes themselves are this piercing yellow, which I think is really effective. And I think this looks really good. Now, again, my same criticism goes when it comes to the shading and the washes that are just not apparent here on this figure, which is a real shame. But otherwise, the sculpting itself is excellent, and the colours of the plastics they've used are pretty much pitch perfect, although the only thing I would say is that they tend to be a little bit duller because of the colour tones that they've gone for, but that is accurate to what we see on screen, so I can't fault it for that. It just makes it a lot less colourful, a lot less presentable in what is otherwise a very colourful collection. Now, as far as I can tell, most of these parts have been recycled before, but there are some brand new pieces, including those fins on the lower forearms and on the shins of the legs as well. And we have brand new feet. These are brand new sculpts, which I think are really cool and definitely distinctively unique to this character. I don't think they could recycle this anywhere else. So this is very cool. I also really like the arches on his sort of shoulder cannons there, which are really, really nicely done. Looking at the articulation, then, he does have a ball joint at the top of the neck, but he does really struggle to move his head from side to side because of that mullet there bashing against those shoulder cannons, which is a little bit disappointing that it's not a bit more flexible, which is a shame. That being said, though, he can tilt his head all the way forward and all the way back. There's actually a surprising range of motion here, so that kind of makes up for it a little bit. Of course, he's got ball joints in the shoulders, allowing the arms to kick up and outwards. There's the complementary bicep swivel, and there's a double joint at the elbow, so really nice to see this make a return here. There is a pin swivel at the wrist, so that hand can rotate all the way around, and of course it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. There's another straight swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to move from side to side, and then he also has that ungainly ab crunch in the centre of his chest, although he wears it a little bit better than Peter Parker, I think. And this allows a huge range of motion, so I think it's forgivable, because it will let him bend all the way forwards and all the way back, which is pretty fantastic. Now, there's good ball joints in the hips as well, and those legs to kick out to the side. There's the complementary thigh swivel at the top of the leg there. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and of course there's a double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back, which is great to see. And then finally we have this ankle pivot, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also tilt from side to side. What's a real shame is that there's no toe articulation, because there is a primary point here where that could easily be employed, but they haven't gone for it. Sadly, he's very light when it comes to accessories. He just comes with an alternate pair of open hands, which is a little bit disappointing. Now, I wouldn't expect an awful lot of accessories to come with this figure, but maybe an alternate head sculpt, or maybe some blast effects for those shoulder cannons. As a quick size comparison then, here he is next to the Peter Parker. As you can see, he's a lot bulkier, he's slightly taller perhaps as well, but they contrast very nicely against each other, and I think they look pretty screen accurate if nothing else. If you're curious, here he is standing next to the Green Goblin, who's a lot more colourful, a lot more eye-catching I suppose when you first see him, and he contrasts again very quite nicely against Smythe here. Similarly, here he is standing next to Dr. Octopus, and again we can definitely see the real contrast between the brightness of Dr. Octopus's versus the slightly more muted tones of Smythe. So then for me, this is another 3-star figure, I'm afraid. And again, this isn't a bad rating, but the more I've thought about it, the more I've had this figure on display, the more I realised there's something a little bit underwhelming, a little bit disappointing about this figure. And I think a lot of it comes down to the overall visual representation, especially when we stand him in line with the other figures in the collection, because they are so colourful, they are so bright, and that's one of the chief joys of the animated series. And this character is a lot more muted, a lot duller in his appearance. Although that is pretty screen accurate, I still feel that maybe they could have lightened up, say, the trouser area, just to give it a little bit more colour. Again, as I mentioned with Peter Parker, there does seem to be a real lack of washes and shading over this figure, and I know that that might be appropriate giving the context of it coming from the animated series, but I really like just a little bit of something extra, a little bit of extra paint wash over my figures just to enhance some of this detail. I think, would have still kept the authenticity of what we see on screen, but also allowed to a little bit more detail to seep through in the figure itself. As it is, there's just something a little bit bland about the figure, and I feel like they could have gone some way to mitigate this by introducing some extra fun accessories, whether that be alternate heads or, like I said, blast effects coming out of the cannons, whatever it might be. I think there's things they could have done to really make this figure a bit more exciting than they did. And so there you have it. Now, I appreciate this is a very highly anticipated set, and I've given relatively low scores, just coming in a sort of average there with 3 stars each. And I don't want to dissuade you, and I don't want to put you off and say that these are disappointing figures. I think the phrase I'd use is underwhelming, and that's really down to the colours, I think, more than anything else. Now, of the two, I think my preference would be for the Peter Parker. I'm really, really glad to have this in my collection, and in all truth, I'm really glad to have both of these figures in my collection, but I think there's just something a little bit more dull about the Smythe, and a lot of that has to do with the plastics that they've used in terms of his overall colouring and how he fits in the collection with the other figures. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing really inherently wrong with these figures, but I just think they could have been improved on when it comes to accessories, or maybe a little bit of extra detailing in the paint apps here and there. But all in all, this is a really nice set. It's definitely worth picking up if you're fans of these characters, and if you're a fan of the animated series. Of course, actually going to want to have these because they're so close to what we see on screen, which is absolutely wonderful. So, as I said, please don't get me wrong, I think these are very worthy additions to the collection if you are an animated series fan, but in comparison to the Green Goblin and Mary Jane set, which just came, they do pale, I would say. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.